That in general, a group of health plan and a health insurance issuer offering group or individual health insurance shall, at a minimum, provide coverage and not impose any cost-sharing requirements. And there were 4 areas. Well, let's go back. I missed the first one. Evidence-based items or services that have an A or B rating from the recommendations of the United States Preventive Services Task Force. That's not a government group, that's an NGO. And that group has been making recommendations in the insurance industry for a number of years. But Obamacare has elevated their recommendations to federal law in terms of what has to be covered if it has an A or a B rating. There are a lot of things that don't have an A or B rating that should be covered. Number 2, immunizations. Number 3, with respect to infants, children, and adolescents, evidence-informed preventive care and screening. And then this is the one to which the Hobby Lobby case is stemmed from. Number 4, with respect to women, such additional preventive care and screenings not described in paragraph 1 as provided for in comprehensive guidelines supported by HRSA, which is the Health Resources and Services Administration. What's interesting, in the fall of 2009, it was around October, November, I watched most of the C-SPAN committees as the Health Care Act was moving through the committee process. And on the Senate side, they were discussing the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, the group that we just mentioned in paragraph 1. They had made a recommendation at that time that women over the age of mammograms should be covered if they were administered to women over the age of 50. And up to that time, a lot of insurance policies would cover the mammograms if they were over the age of 40 or even younger, some policies. And it became extremely controversial in the public's viewpoint. Talked about on radio shows, TV programs were covering it. It got a lot of press with the public. And because of the public attention to that one recommendation from that group, language was added here below paragraph 4, where it says, and for the purposes of this act, the current recommendations of the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force regarding breast cancer screening, mammography, and prevention shall be considered the most current, other than those issued on or around November. In other words, going back to that paragraph 1 that said we have to take the recommendations of that group, we're not going to take the recommendations on the mammographies that were issued in November of 2009. Language means everything. What about a recommendation that's similar on a different date? They dated that so that anything with a different date still falls under the paragraph 1. It makes no difference. But what happened with regard to HRSA in paragraph 4 is it took a couple of years because March 23rd, 2010 was when the final version of Obamacare was signed by the president. This one copy you're looking at is the Senate passed version that passed Christmas Eve in December of 2009. But what happened it took a couple of years for the HRSA to get their regs written. If you'll notice, when you're seeing media reports on whether it's the Hobby Lobby lawsuit, there are actually 94 different pieces of litigation on this one concept that I'm going to be describing to you with Hobby Lobby. Hobby Lobby isn't the only case. But with regard to the scope of what was being considered, this section goes on to say that nothing in this subsection shall be construed to prohibit a plan or issuer from providing coverage for services or to deny coverage for services that are not recommended by the task force. So that seems to imply that there's some flexibility with regard to the insurance providers. Then in August 3rd of 2011, HHS regulations were issued with regard to the HRSA regulations. And those regulations, when you see the media reports, it's going to talk about the HHS regulations. It's not going to talk about Obamacare requirements. And this is a very important concept that's thrown throughout this bill. There are more than 800 references in this bill as to what the secretary shall do. There are more than 300 references in the bill in terms of what the secretary may do, permissive authority. So what the bill essentially does, all of these very important references, is to hand off what the guts, what the details are going to be to the executive branch agencies. So Congress wrote this massive legislation with more than 1,100 references to what would be executed through regs in the executive branch. It's stunning. The regulations on this particular issue with regard to the Hobby Lobby litigation require employers to provide insurance covering abortifacients and contraceptives without cost sharing, even if the employer objects on religious grounds. And when the regs were issued, there was a waiver that was given to religious institutions that were churches. But you have other employers that are not actual churches, like Catholic colleges, Christian colleges, hospitals. You know, there are massive amounts of employees that are affected by these regs and their employers. The new mandate compels religious employers to subsidize coverage for contraceptives, sterilization, and related patient education and counseling, and that's out of the Federal Register. I've got the pages cited. Essentially, what this does is anything that's deemed approved by the FDA has to be covered, the full range. And the Green family, I want to share a little bit of information about the owners of Hobby Lobby. David Green and his family, they own more than 500 stores in more than 40 states. They are devout Christians. They believe that it is by God's grace and provision that Hobby Lobby has endured. They believe their employees, this is from their own press release, by the way, it's not a media report, it's their own wording. They believe their employees should have the opportunity to spend Sundays with their families. The company is closed on Sundays and only operates 66 hours per week. They also, they don't have any moral objection to the contraceptives, but there's, in the FDA regulations, there's a phrase or a term that's referred to as emergency contraceptives, and that is the Plan B or Ella, which would be the morning after pill or the week after pill, which is an abortifacient. It terminates the life of the fertilized egg after it's been fertilized and life has begun. And that violates the sincere religious belief of the Green family. The government would say you give up that when you are an employer. You don't have the right to be protected under the Free Exercise Clause in the First Amendment. And you all know that the First Amendment does include a Free Exercise Clause, right?
Yes.
It's not just protection from the establishment of religion, but Congress shall not establish a law that inhibits or the free exercise of religion. That does not mean that that protection is bound within the walls on Sundays or whatever the day of worship is. That means as we live out our lives in our daily life, we should be allowed, protected through the Constitution, to exercise by our lives what we sincerely believe in our faith. And that is the basis of the litigation. There are, as I said before, I think 94 different pieces of litigation, split pretty evenly between for-profits and non-profits in terms of entities that are standing up and saying, this mandate is wrong, we should not have to comply. What I stated before, the Green family has no moral objection to the use of preventive contraceptives, but when it comes to the abortifacients, they do not believe the government should make them pay for those. And I personally agree with that position. This is a case that's going to be heard next week at the Supreme Court. The oral arguments will be on the 25th. This slide is describing the temporary enforcement for safe harbor. That was, again, temporary. Even for the churches, it was a temporary waiver. So it's not a permanent waiver.